Hi, I just heard. Oh my god. Hi.
Hi, you're still echoing right now.
Sorry, I didn't know what to do. Okay, hi. I'm really sorry. That was really chaotic. Okay, hi. Can you guys hear me better now?
Yep, it's much clearer.
Okay, absolutely fantastic. I'll just restart my speech again. Oh yeah, pure eyes verbally, please. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Before I begin with my speech proper, a few definitions for the House today and characterization. What exactly does, in the status quo, military interventionism look like? It looks like either the direct funding to foreign militaries and the provision of expertise and infrastructure, and what we want, as well as the US literally just directly intervening into the conflict in the country, sending troops to that country to fight off whatever country that they deem is not in their goes against their interests. So what is it that we instead want on our world? Not military, non-interventionism and military isolationism. This would mean a shift towards things like diplomacy and generally less funding towards foreign military operations, both in terms of domestically as well as in terms of just sending money to foreign countries. All right. Moving on to my two thoughts of the House today about how war is morally abhorrent, and secondly, how it hurts the international standing of the US. All right, onto my first up about how war is morally abhorrent. Two facets. Recognize that war is inherently dehumanizing. War involves the dehumanization of soldiers, from people with complexities and individual qualities to unimportant, insignificant entities. It diminishes them to mere fighting machines, devoid of human desires and emotion, existing purely to engage in barbaric fighting and killing. You perpetuate the concept of soldiers being disposable, being milked for all their worth, and being tossed after they have run their course. This further emphasizes the idea that in war, soldiers are not seen as humans and are instead pawns to further a nation's advancement. Secondly, war is deceitful. The concept of glory in war is ambiguous and unclear, and how it is used to tempt soldiers into service, and yet it cannot be promised. When presented to others, as painted in the public's eye, war is grand and brave. The fighters are unified and formidable. In reality, they end up dying undignified deaths on the battlefield without proper ceremony or ritual. Insofar as Opp agrees that the US should continue inadvertently violating the moral rights of soldiers on both sides by enabling war and destroying lives, dehumanizing soldiers and seeing them as nothing but pawns is the point in which they stand for a morally unjust world. All right, moving on to my second sub about how it's the international standing of the US. Two tiers for this. Firstly, about how you make the conflict worse, and secondly, about how the economic standing of the US just takes a hit. Firstly, about how you make the conflict worse. What are the current conflicts that the US tends to intervene in anyway? We think that they generally have two main interests. Firstly, to protect allies and liberate countries that are quote unquote under oppression. So this looks like Korea in the Korean War, in which they tried to help and protect South Korea, or Iraq, where they wanted to liberate them from Saddam Hussein, a very terrorist dictator. In terms of personal interest, they often look like the Gulf Wars, as well as them wanting to preserve their interest for oil. So secondly, how do they tend to intervene? Firstly, they will tend to militarily intervene first. So i.e. you send your soldiers there and you embark on ground combat. And so the aim is usually to overthrow leaders, and from there, you institute leaders friendly to you and then rebuild the democratic country from there. How does this tend to go wrong? Two reasons. Firstly, you're unable to actually win ground combat. So basically, you just have long drawn-out conflicts and guerrilla warfare that the US troops are unable to handle. Recognize the entire idea is status quo, that the US military is incredibly strong and incredibly advanced. Insofar as they are unable to win these conflicts, they ruin the international prestige of the US military. Secondly, you spark anti US sentiment in the nation. Insofar as you are creating a large amount of destruction and probably killing a lot of people, you further aggravate groups, anti-US groups inside these nations. For example, Islamic fundamentalist groups are now able to encourage citizens to join as they further aggravate anti-US sentiment and bring up the idea of a holy war. Secondly, how do you ruin nation building? People within the country are hostile to you insofar as their friends and family were probably killed by some of your soldiers, even if it's just accidentally or, for example, via drone strikes. Consider the nature of countries that tend to be invaded. They also oftentimes tend to be dictatorships with cults of personalities, so sometimes the citizens don't even see you as helping them. They see you as actively harming them and ruining their country. Second, you literally just destroy infrastructure. We think it's hard to rebuild a nation from scratch and get good governance when all of your infrastructure is ruined and you need to basically get the funds to rebuild and so as well clear out all of the debris. Thirdly, how does US interventionism lead to huge social debt weight loss and go against their political ideology? Let's take the example of the US intervention in Israel. The state of Israel has legalized a formal system of discrimination against Palestinian Arabs, in which the Palestinians are exploited, oppressed, and isolated in occupied territories. They also passed legislation that forbids spouses of Arab Israeli citizens who are in occupied territories from joining their families in Israel, with very small exceptions. The reasons for such legislation is to help maintain the Jewish demographic in Israel, which discriminates against Palestinians Arabs. The Israeli government enacts laws and employs its military to keep Palestinian Arab civilians from returning to their homes following the end of fighting, violating UN resolutions ordering them to respect the Palestinians' right to return to their homes. These are all flagrant violations to not only international law, but also discriminatory prejudice done by the state of Israel and America, as a champion of self-determination and ensuring human rights across the world, should put an end to these violations by discontinuing financial and military aid
before 6.
Israel. All right, what's the impact of this? In the best case scenario, for the US, you have millions of soldiers killed and you have large amounts of military funds all going to waste, and you're just unable to fulfill your goal most of the time. And sometimes you even make the situation even worse, insofar as you retreat and leave behind instability, or you have an unstable government, and you're just more likely to have a backslide to authoritarianism, insofar as your presence aggravated fringe groups, and now they have a better presence to actually revolt against your new government, in addition to just worsening fighting and just causing more lives to be destroyed. All right, moving on really quickly to my second tier about how economic standing of the US and how that becomes terrible. All right, what does the US economy currently look like? It looks like high amounts of trading and globalization, and even with protectionism rising, we think this is a very significant part of the US economy. So how do you worsen your economic standing? Two main actors. You spark anti-US sentiment in the third world, insofar as many of them are dictatorships, and when the US is literally invading countries they see as not democratic enough, they have an incentive to move away from the US, as they see the US as a threat to them and they want to reduce dependence. Secondly, you spark anti-US sentiment outside in the West. Its current sentiment on the world is that war is bad and diplomacy is a preferable option. And if they see you actively intervening militarily in wars, they see you as an aggressor, your international standing worsens. So how does this cause the US economy to be terrible? Firstly, countries reduce trade with you. Insofar as people in countries overseas see war as bad and they pressure their government to do something, they're likely to implement some level of sanctions and tariffs as protest. And second, you effectively cut out trade from the third world. As I said, they want to reduce dependence. But even worse, they are likely to they still going to need this funding, and they're likely to turn to actors like China as well, other countries that are actively against the US. So you just get more countries against you in your side. It's for all these reasons that it's against the US interest, and hence I am so proud to propose. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much for that speech. Now to open the class. Hello.
All right, am I audible?
Yep, you're clear.
All right, I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. Undoing the US's costly efforts during the Cold War is denying the sacrifices of the troops in Afghanistan and Vietnam and regressing allegedly the world's greatest nation to nothing but a farce of its previous glory. Right, before substantive, I'll engage with what the 3 things coming out from PM. PM first told you about a principle that war is dehumanizing. 2 responses then. Yes, A, war is dehumanizing. We are not trying to dispute that, but this literally doesn't matter in this debate because this is an actual debate where we need to explain what is in the best interest of the US. You need to tell us why dehumanizing is bad specifically for the US in order to win, but you don't do that. Second, the US has always acted as a check and balance to warmongering nations because war is inevitable and always has happened and will happen, as it is happening now in Russia and Ukraine. The US actively acts out against North Korea that threatens to nuke the rest of the world, right? Or Russia with its recent intrusion into Ukraine, right? The comparative then on prop that they never tell us is that more war is likely to happen and war is prolonged on their side when there is no opposing force to end it, and when the opposing force that Opp provides is coincidentally the strongest military power in the world. Second thing they tell us then, international standing is hurt, and the US portrayal to the rest of the world will be bad because of two things. First, they tell us that the US cannot win ground combat and that battles will be prolonged and then therefore they will lose international respect. This is not true, right? The US has, for the most of the time, they have won the conflicts that they've been involved in simply because their military power is so much stronger than the rest of the world. And B, the comparative on prop is that even with the stronger military of the world, they are seen as cowardly, unimportant, and incapable because they are not doing anything to intervene in wars, right? This is much worse on prop because this directly conflicts the US principles of wanting to be interventionist and wanting to be a great protector of the rest of the world. When the US has this lack of consistency in stance, the rest of the world will lose faith in the US as a protector, as it once acted as in the Cold War against the influence of Russia. B, then prop tells us somehow the US will spark anti-US sentiment and inspire terrorist groups to attack the US. This isn't exclusive to prop because groups like the jihadists and ISIS already do antagonize the US even without this, because the West is often portrayed as immoral and antithetical to the Islamic religion by these terrorists, right? They believe that the US is against their religion. So they're going to attack them anyway. And second response, war is bad, right? But if you intervene in wars, the US is not likely to be seen as the aggressor because often the US is willing and actively tries to take a moral high ground. The US paints the communists in Vietnam and Cuba as tyrannical and people who perpetuate the suffering of the people on the ground. That's why they have an excuse now to invade these countries and install democratic governments that will increase the popularity of the US and make the US be perceived as like a savior of democracy around the world. Third, then prop says that the US takes bad moral stances, right? Like the Israel-Palestine conflict. Notice the problem with this example is that funding is not military interventionism. Military interventionism or military isolationism has to do with how you use your military. Is when you send your own military forces to aid foreign countries. The US doesn't send its military to Israel. The US provides funding and publicly declares that it supports them. It's not the same thing. Anyways, the problem with this then is that even if this was interventionism, prop never told you why bad moral stances are bad in the eyes of the international community. Even when US funds Israel, it did not waver US's influences over everyone else. Even when China perpetrates human rights crimes, many countries around the world still support China. So I have no idea what's the harm here. Right. First argument then. We tell you that the US has an active incentive to establish its influence and expand its global hegemony because it is a superpower and it wants more power. No. This means that the US is better able to expand its influence as a global superpower if it is interventionist. Two layers of analysis. First, how the US wants to expand its influence. There are three ways. A, military power, B, economic powers, and C, soft power, international influences. Second layer then, why the US exclusively accomplishes these three things with military interventionism. On military power, even though we concede that likely on both sides, US is going to heavily invest in their own military equipment, the comparative here on Opp is that when the US wants to actively use that military to intervene around the world, there's more investment and more development of US's military strength. Therefore, the US will have comparatively larger numbers and higher sophistication of things like submarines, aircraft carriers, and bombers. Second, of economic powers. US is uniquely a manufacturing country with lots of heavy industries like automobile industries, weapon industry, etc. They need large amounts of raw materials to sustain their economy. It's much easier to obtain raw materials from overseas and create trade relationships if they have international influence. Smaller countries will perceive the US as an international protector on our side, as they already do in status quo, and are incentivized to have good relations with them for more security. Before that, I'll take one.
How will the US not be seen as hypocritical when they are one of the leading countries in the UN, yet simultaneously violate UN human rights conventions?
I don't understand what that POI is supposed to mean, because they aren't perceived as hypocritical in status quo, and they are the leading superpower simply because of their economic and military influence, right? These things don't matter to a country. What matters to countries that support the US is that the US is strong, therefore I want to get the protection of the US and not its moral stances, Right, on soft power then, with active military presence around the world, other countries are more likely to feel the US's power, meaning when US has military operations in the Middle East and stations their troops at the demilitarized zone in the border between North and South Korea, US is then perceived as more powerful because their militaries have an active effect in creating and stopping conflict. Countries are more aware of their presence as a superpower. By conquering the Middle East then, US is able to proclaim itself as a liberator, as I said earlier. Then C, this necessarily means US nationalism is also better able to hold sway over their people, because now everyone thinks that the US is the best and strongest country in the world. So this prevents brain drain of their own citizens towards other countries, and it also increases immigration of skilled workers wanting to seek a better life in the US. Second argument, coming from DLO, will tell you why we need to prevent a power vacuum, and why when other actors and superpowers like China and Russia step into the vacuum left by the US, the world will be much worse off, and you don't fulfill Props principle of wanting to keep peace and that war is bad. Oppose.
Right, thank you so much for that speech. Now to extend the case for the government, DPM. Here.
Hi, can I check if I'm audible?
Yep, you're clear.
Okay. All right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Firstly, a big clarification to make, right? What is the government counterfactual if not for direct US intervention? We rely on international bodies like the NATO and UN to decide when it is appropriate to intervene militarily. And we are perfectly okay with other measures like tariffs and sanctions that are not inherently militaristic, right? Recognize that these are going to be even more effective on our side now that we no longer devote $800 billion of the US federal reserves to the military, but instead channel it into strengthening the economy. Currently, tariffs against Russia are not useful because China can still give some sort of aid, right? But if the US stop wasting money on military intervention that doesn't reap them any conclusive benefit and usually results in a withdrawal of forces after years of drawn out conflict, then the US would necessarily have more power and economic weight, including countries that are likely to need military interventions have more economic power in comparison to other huge powers. They can regain their weight in global matters and hence are able to put up a more formidable front against countries like Russia. Then they tell us this really funny thing about how we will not have more money to enact better non-militaristic policies because the budget devoted towards the military will remain the same. This literally makes no sense, right? Insofar as you no longer have to spend your money to send troops and tanks and anti-ballistic missiles to Israel, Afghanistan, and the Middle East, you don't have to spend the same amount of money on military infrastructure that isn't going to be used or shipped out. It is then more money would be channeled into developing the military where you don't waste your resources, right? They then tell us that, oh no, military manufacturing will be hit worse. I think then on our side, when we get rid of the black holes that is funding foreign military operations, then we are able to fund things like reskilling that actually strengthen the US economy in the long term, right? What else did they tell us in their response? Firstly, they said that morals don't matter in this debate. Yes, this is an actor debate, but principles and morals usually transcend individual interests. And again, this is not true when we link it to like the specific context of the US, right? Recognize that this doesn't make sense, especially in the context of the USA, insofar as the US government has been projecting their image as the global arbiter of morals, freedoms, and rights. And we think that then the US needs to be seen as principally just. We have told you that US intervention in Israel literally resulted in the killing and like displacement of people from their homes. I tell you that this is the point in which you don't respect sovereignty and you don't respect human freedoms. And this is just seen as a huge contradiction insofar as the US wants to project this image of them as like someone who is like morally just and protector of human rights, blah, blah, blah. What else did they say? The US is powerful and can conquer the entire Middle East, and wow, they will have all this power, right? Not true. We already told you that the US does not necessarily win all of their conflicts. Like look at Vietnam and Afghanistan. Like recently, they literally just pulled out and left out like Afghanistan with the Taliban leadership, right? I don't know what utopian world opposition is living in where like the US is so strong and like can take over the world, right? And we tell tell you that even when they pull out, right, this undermines the image of the US military as something that is strong. It in fact shows that they are ultimately weak, and in the process of like just not winning, they waste a lot of resources. So even if they don't win the conflict, we tell you that the power and status quo is not always about military power, insofar as diplomacy is seen as the preferable alternative, right? Not only is this better achieved on our side with a shift towards diplomacy, you also do not tarnish your image by doing something the world actively condemns. Before I move on, yes, sure.
When you say that when the US pulls out for Israel, they are now perceived as weak and ineffective, that's exactly what Opp is arguing. If the US abstains for any and all conflicts, the world will treat them as a useless country with a big military that does nothing.
Okay, so even if I'm a big military that does nothing, and in the end both of us lose, I think it's better on government when we are seen as weak, but we don't need to waste our resources to just end up at the same end goal where you are seen as weak, right? Okay, now leads on to my very nice point about huge opportunity cost. So what does US spending on the military look like? It looks like $800 billion a year. A huge amount of federal budget is spent primarily on the military. Let's look at the state of the US economy, right? It is going through a general downturn for a few reasons. Firstly, the rise of competition, i.e. China. China has risen as an extremely powerful economic powerhouse, providing cheap labor, low-cost manufacturing, and a growing talent pool. Plus, increased economic influence in the East means that China's goods and services have been able to compete with the US, right? China uniquely was able to carry out these following policies. Firstly, large-scale capital investment, and this was financed by large domestic savings and foreign investments, right? The Chinese government invested huge sums of money into Chinese industries. And secondly, we talk about rapid productivity growth. The Chinese government was able to fund education programs and upskilling for workers to increase productivity. Secondly, we talk about COVID, right? It spelled a general recession for the US. The ability of the US to fund economic policies to maintain workers' rights and keep people employed is measly at best. This can be seen in how people in the US still struggle with remaining employed, right? Let's talk about the state of public goods then, things like education and healthcare. Currently, public education in the US is in a state of disarray. It is a system wherein teachers are underpaid and simultaneously have to draw out money of their own pockets to pay for classroom supplies. Additionally, the US healthcare system is unable to cope with the pandemic, much less operate functionally with the regular influx of patients, insofar as people in the US would rather take a taxi to the hospital in times of an emergency as opposed to an ambulance, because an ambulance ride can cost up to $1,000. We tell you that the US government has fundamentally failed in protecting the rights of their citizens, right? We tell you, what does the state of welfare looks like? It looks like high concentrations of poverty in certain areas like Skid Row in Los Angeles, and how people are barely able to get food stamps and enter homeless shelters, insofar as these shelters are overloaded and they get turned away, right? So how can we increase spending for the public goods and the economy? We divert $800 billion from military spending, given that we no longer need to fund sting operations in Israel, to other needs that the government needs to address. Looks like funding of education policies and investment into US businesses, right? Recognize that this diversion is likely to be extremely beneficial insofar as the current budget devoted to foreign military operations is a lot, right? Why is this necessary and important? Firstly, you widen the gap between the US and the China's economic might, right? And secondly, you provide basic welfare for all US citizens. It is within the interest of the US to do this because for two reasons. Firstly, they need to cater to the needs of voters. Recognize that at the point in which you sacrifice people's ability to live for the sake of fighting wars in countries that you have no personal connection to, is the point in which you become incredibly unpopular with your very own people. You need to keep your citizens appeased with goods and services in the government's best interest to cater to their standard of living. Secondly, we tell you that you increase the productivity of all citizens. At the point in which your citizens are healthier, happier, better educated, you can increase the productivity of all your citizens. This makes for a more efficient economy in the long term, reducing structural unemployment, and in the end, you strengthen the US economy, which is what we need in the here and now, given that the US is currently failing, is currently on a trend of downturn, and is likely going to continue insofar as you continue investing in military interventions that just do not reap you any conclusive benefit. And hence, for all those reasons, I've never been prouder to propose.
All right, thank you so much for that speech. Now to extend the case for your opposition. DLO, you're here.
I'm gonna assume that I'm audible.
Yep, clear.
Okay, great. Yeah, I'm gonna start my speech in 3, 2, and sorry. Yeah, okay, I'm gonna start my speech in 3, 2, and 1. when the United States loses its grips on the influence it has over the international community, the next country that is in line for power will be China, its strongest competitor. A few things I have to address from Proposition's case, right? 3 things. The first on the counterfactual. The counterfactual here is that they're okay with international bodies and like terrorists intervening in these conflicts instead. We tell you then this directly contradicts your principle, in which you later reiterate is so important, right? That it's more important than the benefits of the actor itself. We don't see why this stands here. Number 2, when they talk about how funding for the military is an inherently bad thing on 2 levels, right? Because the US already fails in welfare, and lastly, because it's okay to be seen as weak. We tell you, number 1, even if the US fails in welfare, it is not because they devote 800 billion to the military. It is because their government generally doesn't like public healthcare, not because they're broke. The voters are the one who vote against Democrats like Sanders, who support public healthcare, not the US military. The US military and its system of governance has basically no correlation. Number 2, we tell you that the US GDP is 20 trillion. 800 billion is barely a dent in their coffers. I have no idea what you're talking about when you say 800 billion is too much to take out from 20 trillion, right? Not only that, we can tell you here that military itself already helps military intervention itself already helps expand its area of influence. Edmund already gave you 3 reasons why it's important. Number 1, on how military strength allows other countries to flock to them because of their confidence in military. How military intervention is what opens up routes to economic trade, trade that wasn't available before because of how people feel that they have something to owe to the US. And lastly, we tell you already that even if we lose some money, right, it's still okay because the power of influence is still more important to take care of than it is to pull out just because you think your welfare is failing. Lastly, when they talk about how if you don't win the conflict on our side, it's going to be a bad thing. The biggest problem with Proposition's case here is that they're willing to forfeit all military investment of the US in a world where countries like Russia and China are already stepping up their military spending every year by hundreds of billions. The problem with not winning the conflict is not the problem is we don't have to win the conflict for the US to be seen as a global superpower or for them to expand their influence. By the very fact that they're stepping into the conflict, they show here, 1, that there is a consistency in their principle to defend the human rights of people when they're being violated in other countries, right? 2, they also prove that here they're not willing to bow down to countries like China who are willing to use these proxy wars against the US in the first place. So it doesn't matter if we don't win the conflict, we make a step and we show the world that we're willing to stand up, and therefore it is already a good thing in the first place. Secondly, then on the substantives, on how we prevent a power vacuum which allows other countries like China and Russia to take over instead. 4 layers of analysis, right? The first on how the US already holds a significant amount of influence via military intervention. Look at what Edmund already told you. He already gave you reasons why people want to have how you have influence via intervention. I'm going to tell you how this shows. This looks like the US having a significant amount of influence over the government in Afghanistan when it still was there before it pulled out like it shouldn't have. Having a general amount of influence, it means they had access to their resources. They were able to establish their influence over the Middle East. Not only that, the US having influence over countries like Taiwan because they're supporting Taiwan against China, stuff like that. That just means the US already has a significant amount of influence. And 2, the second layer of analysis on how pulling out creates a power vacuum that will inevitably be filled by other superpowers. 2 reasons. The first, superpowers who have the capacity to establish that influence are countries like China and previously Russia, who are strong and already the direct competitors of the US. There are 3 structural reasons why they are likely to step into the role of the US. First, there is much to gain from military intervention, improvement in militia, your economic prowess, and international influence, right? But secondly, these superpowers are already in direct competition with the US and want to expand their global hegemony as well. It's just basically what a superpower wants. They want to expand their influence so that their decisions as a state has more influence in the international community, and so it's easier for them to mobilize as a country. We see it already looks like China starting up a Belt and Road Initiative to be able to expand its influence over developing nations. If the US steps out now, China is likely to intervene even more through military, so that they can expand their influence to a further extent where they previously couldn't before. 3, specifically, China is already establishing its influence by threatening Taiwan by placing artillery and flying jets over its airspace without permission. China is directly engaging with a trade war with the US and will do anything to undermine it. So if we step out now, lose our influence, China is going to take over, and there will be nothing we can do about it. 3 reasons why this is so bad then. Number 4, 3 reasons why this is so bad then. The first on how if the US loses its role as the most politically influential country, it loses a significant amount of leverage with no presence internationally, which means it's harder for countries to want to agree with the US or support them when they have when they have a suggestion when it comes to the international community. Number 2, the leverage that they lose will instead be taken up by China, a country that does not have the US best interest in mind. This will manifest in 3 ways. First, China having significantly more say in trade deals with the US because of its wide sphere of influence. 2, China, an authoritarian state that has no regard for human rights, having the larger influence over international law, like those regarding to human rights, the ones that the US has been so principally consistent in defending to the point they're willing to go to war for. 3, and lastly, China being free to threaten the US and its allies at a much more audacious level. It looks like setting up military camps at the border of US allies, which lastly means it's going to harm the US influence and its allyship as well, because the general global sentiment will perceive the new shift in power to China being the new premier global superpower and will fear it more than the US and is no longer as likely to side with them. But before 6, any POIs?
Recognize that all the things you said about China are necessarily economic in nature. How do you strengthen the US economic, the US economy, so that trade wars become things that the US doesn't have to face anymore?
I've already told you why military intervention, and Edmund has already told you why military intervention directly leads to a boost in economic prowess. We also told you then the examples I gave you are economic in nature. Yes, the difference is if we proceed with this motion and the US pulls out, it will no longer be economic in nature. China now will expand its military influence as well. This is harmful because I've already told you why it's going to have larger influence. But not only that, China, a generally authoritarian state that doesn't have a regard for human rights or really as much diplomacy as you'd like to think so, having more military influence because it sees the US pulling out and sees an opportunity to step in on behalf of the US, is now going to have this military influence, and it's going to be harmful because when China is the one dictating what the world does, when it's the premier global superpower, the US loses influence, and I don't see how this is going to benefit the US in any way, right? Because we've already told you through these 2 speeches how we're able to benefit the economic prowess of the US by military intervention, how we are preventing China from stepping in and taking over as the global superpower. We believe we have clearly won this debate. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for that speech. Now to summarize the case for the government, GovVip here.
Am I audible?
Yep, you're clear.
Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The side that wins this debate is a side that is able to secure US interests on 2 fronts. The first front being domestic and the second front being international. Before I move on to my 2 clashes for the House today, which are basically these 2 fronts, what exactly do these fronts look like? I think domestic interest, number 1, looks like people having jobs, people having welfare and economic growth and stability, so that the US is able to secure their voter base and ensure that people are not going to protest against them or literally overthrow them insofar as the government is not, providing for their basic needs. Secondly, I think international interest basically being principally consistent over all kinds of international bodies that you belong in, not screwing up the countries that you necessarily lay your hands on, and lastly, being able to project an image of power and an image of economic strength. I think these are the 2 fronts that we're going to engage on today, and basically what oppositions engage with as well. So moving on to my 2 clashes for the House today, on firstly, who's able to secure the domestic interests of the US, and secondly, who's able to secure the international interests of the US. On the first question about domestic interests, opposition literally says only one thing about this, is that the military is important to give people jobs. Maybe just recognize the US is literally not a war economy, right? So unless you're telling me that literally everybody produces military infrastructure for the military, and therefore the economy literally relies on the military, which is, by the way, factually untrue, then you literally have no benefit, right? I think necessarily what does the US economy look like now? I think the US economy is necessarily capitalist, so you sell goods and services and you need money to produce them. And secondly, more importantly, is globalization, right? So things like trading and being able to have good relationships with other countries countries in order to like get export revenue and things like that. I think necessarily what happens here is that military ruins the image of the US insofar as A, you're shown as somebody who doesn't care about human rights insofar as you're able to shoot people in Israel and Palestine. And two, like basically like losing these wars and then being shown as a not strong person, as a person that can lose wars and therefore loses the kinds of confidence that you need in order for people to actually engage in the economy, right? So recognize that given that they tell us in the one-liner that military is important to give people jobs, then they don't give a shit about the domestic interests of these countries anyway. I think like Rei Ya and Ashley already tell you like multiple reasons as to why we actually care about the domestic interests of the US, right? I think firstly, we have more money to spend on welfare. They tell us in the one-liner that we will not have money to spend on welfare because the budget will be same like in the military and both side of the house. Because this is not true, right? Insofar as you don't have to like spend money on like sending operations overseas, and you only need to care about the military that protects the US by itself, is why you necessarily need to spend less money. I think this is very, very important. This is very, very like basic to understand. This very basic logic. Unless you're proving to me, unless you're going to tell me that like the money that is not going to be spent on like military infrastructure sent to Israel is going to be spent on military infrastructure that's laying around and doing nothing. I think importantly, we get more money to like, why this is important is because more money to spend on welfare necessarily means direct benefits for welfare, right? So things like education, things like having affordable housing, which necessarily impact the standard of living of US citizens themselves. I think secondly, you can basically spend more money on actually uplifting the economy of the US, right? Which is incredibly important on both the domestic front and the international front, which I'll tell you about later. But firstly, on the idea of the domestic front, basically having more economic growth means that people just get better jobs. We just see this as a net benefit. Side opposition is never able to co-opt this insofar as to just give zero analysis to how this is the case. More importantly, on the idea of international, I think then the second clash about international interests comes to the forefront, right? Because that's the only thing that opposition is willing to engage us on. Like before I move on to the actual clash, important clarification for like our case for today, right? I think like Rei Ya already gives you what the counterfactual is, but the counterfactual basically is that we're willing to engage in non-militaristic like measures that actually put pressure on countries. So things like tariffs and sanctions. And we also tell you that these things are going to be even more effective than military intervention insofar as like you no longer devote 800 billion to military, but instead like strengthen the economy so you can actually fight trade wars with China and actually win them, right? Because currently the reason why trade wars are like China has the balls to do trade wars with China and China has the balls to like go against the tariffs that the US puts on them is because China has the economic strength to do so. Insofar as you necessarily like, you know, maybe cut down like 2/3 of the military spending that like literally the US does, which is by the way what China is spending on the military, right? Is when you're actually able to devote these kinds of money into like economic policies that actually make you be able to win the trade wars with China because you have a stronger economy, because more countries rely on your economy and rely on your exports. So opposition never gives us a response. We literally don't see why they engage. I think then they tell us that with the thrust of their case is like saying that without the US, superpowers will be conquering other countries that the US have not been intervening in. First of all, has China, is there a historical precedence for this? Has China been conquering other countries militaristically? No. Recognize that Daphne says trade war and BRI. Recognize that these are economic in nature, right? So the US already cannot militarily intervene into these countries insofar as there's nothing to militarily intervene into. There are no wars. There's like no like conflict that you can intervene. China specifically in this context is engaging in an economic sense because that's where the bulk of their power lies, right? It's in an economic area because of the fact that the government has spent tons of money into actually pushing into industries that allow like more and more countries to be reliant on their economy is where like this is where China has been conquering other countries in an economic sense, right? So recognize that insofar as you're never able to whittle away at the economic power of China is where you're not able to like prevent things like trade wars, prevent things like BRI, no response other than, oh, but military matters sometimes. Yeah. Secondly, they tell us that China will not intervene in the Middle East. Recognize that this literally because think about what the US has been intervening in, right? Recognize that this is primarily the Middle East. So now that the US is gone, will China intervene in the Middle East? Recognize that this is not true for a few reasons. First of all, proximity. China is literally like not close enough to the Middle East for them to care. Secondly, OPEC. Recognize that there are still incredibly powerful organizations within the Middle East that China doesn't necessarily want to offend, given that their economic power and their economic prowess necessarily relies on OPEC anyway. I think lastly, China literally just has other interests in, for example, Africa. So why does the US intervene in the Middle East, right? Historical ties and oil. China literally cares about neither because they already have the oil and don't have historical ties towards the Middle East. And therefore, they're going to prefer Asian countries, which, by the way, the US has not been meaningfully engaging in status quo today anyway. I think lastly, opposition says we don't have to win the conflict. We can step into the conflict, which shows that we stand up for people. Look, recognize that this literally doesn't make sense. We look at historical precedents, right? So look, for example, look at Vietnam, look like the historical context of Vietnam and the current, by the way, context of Afghanistan. So what happened to the US here? The US failed miserably and fell flat on their faces. They had to pull out of each respective countries, and the opposing powers within these countries won. I don't understand why this is something that is going to be extremely appealing towards international communities. Insofar as the US is weak, the US isn't able to win wars. They tell us that the counterfactual is that the US will not go to war in the first place. I think this is A, great because we tell you that war is bad, and B, you don't give the chance for the US to fail and show that you can actually fall your face as a military country, right? I think this necessarily shows, importantly, that the US is able to remain partial towards human rights, the UNHCR, which by the way they chair or whatever, they actually have very important power in. And so far as you are unable to prove how US is able to win conflicts, prove how US is going to stop Chinese economic influence, it's the point at which you lose this debate. Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much for that speech. That does summarize the case for the opposition. Opp it. Here.
Hi, I'm just checking my audible.
Yup, clear.
Okay, give me a moment to set my timer. Starting my speech in three, 2, 1. Okay, probably to understand that it literally does not matter if the world thinks you're morally good, because now when you stop spending money on military, other countries will fear China more, meaning they're likely to side with China in international issues. Now the US's grip over the world falters, and this is something the US wants to avoid at all costs, right? Okay, then when you tell us about economy, we tell you how on your side of the house it is far worse, because it's simply because countries aren't likely to want to trade with you now. Even the kindergartner can understand this, right? It's logic. Secondly, you have to then understand that we don't have to fix conflict at any cost. Moving on, clarifications. What are the main problems coming from their side in their counterfactual, right? Okay, it is a direct contradiction with their principle to even begin with. If they're so okay with the counterfactual in the first place, why are they not okay with the US intervention, right? Because their counterfactual is literally on intervention, when this intervention is going to be largely made out of the US's military. Secondly, they think that to win this debate today, they have to protect their people, but I'll tell you why this is also my speech later on. So, moving on. Thirdly, okay, earlier on, they wanted to talk about what happens when the US mess up, right? Okay, you have to realize that US already have a large influence and power, and people fuck up all the time. And at the very least, the US tries, and that's what matters. But even so, does not have to prove to you how this benefits the US. We only have to prove to you why the US would want to do this, which is because they're so goddamn competitive to even begin with, right? And secondly, they don't want China to overpower them. And moving on, so even if the US does not succeed, insofar as it only concerns the best interest of the US, which is that they don't lose to China, it doesn't matter if they fail. So long as China does not have space for overpowering US, it is enough. Moving on, first speaker, rebuttals. Okay, firstly, the PI to Edmund. Oh, never mind. There was a first speaker. PI to Edmund. I think it was very funny, right? When you say the US is the front of the UN, and now it'll be seen as hypocritical, but to simply put this, we think the UN's objective is simply to protect its member and anything, right? The UN peacekeeping force that will send its largely made out of the US personnel. So instead of being seen as hypocrites, they're seen as fulfilling international obligation to keep peace. Whereas to simply put this, it's funny how on your side of the house, then you tell us that it is hypocritical of the US to intervene, but then you have to realize that under your side of the house, they are seen more as hypocrites, is that they will be blamed for not doing, although they are strong. They have an obligation towards protecting, towards peace, right? Second speaker, talking about how US not winning and US pulling out. US not winning does not matter in this debate, because insofar as other superpowers like China cannot outpower them, it is enough. What's funny is that later they tell you there is competition. We don't see how the strong point of theirs even stand. Moving on, third speaker, welfare, because never engage with Diallo. Okay, Diallo said 3 things. US has 20 trillion GDP. Their 800 billion military spending is a drop in the bucket, means nothing to them. Secondly, the 800 billion can help US win the trade war with China, right? Oh, never mind. Let me continue back. Oh, okay. when the 800 billion is literally nothing to the US, it means if US wanted to care about welfare, they would have done so without needing to put any dent in their military funding. Only reason why welfare is so shit in the US is because people don't vote for welfare policies in the first place. Secondly, the 800 billion can help US win the trade war with China, right? Okay, it's really funny for you to assume this. If US has 19.2 trillion budget left to win a trade war and cannot, why then can they do so with 800 billion, right? We don't understand how this makes sense. Thirdly, how China does not care about the Middle East. Okay, it's not true at all. Egypt and other Middle Eastern countries are one of the biggest beneficiaries of One Belt, One Road. China has a vested interest in the Middle East and will become the main influence there if the US stop being one. And this is what the US does not want to achieve. Moving on. So clashes, stance, very simple, right? Okay. On Gulf, they tell you that US should not intervene. But then later on, they tell you that their counterfactual is that they're okay with NATO and things of such to intervene, right? We don't see how their counterfactual is even smart, and we tell you that it's contradictory. But even so, let's argue with them on those points. Okay, what is the main clash of this debate? Because they want to argue on those sides, right? Okay, we tell you what is the best interest of the US. But no, Prop wants to talk to you about which is better for the principle of doing good and whatnot, right? Then let's look at it. Okay, on Opp first, very simple. We tell you on 3 main points. Firstly, access to resources. Prop can tell you this is on the assumption that it is successful. We tell you this is false. Firstly, no one goes into something for the sake of knowing that they can win something out of it. They go into something because they want to try to achieve something out of it. Similarly, when you join the debate tournament, you don't join knowing that you can win. You join because you want to try and win. Secondly, it doesn't matter after all. We see this as a net gain that Prop cannot provide you into this debate. But even so, Opp does not need to prove to you that US has to be successful to be incentivized to do it. We just have to tell you why they would want to do it, which we already fulfill our task in today's debate. But even if you don't buy into it, we still have the other 2 points that Prop cannot respond to. Moving on. US wants to expand its influence as a global superpower, right? We tell you it is only when US uses its military that it increases its strength, and when this is so, it increases the front of its economy and soft power. The comparative is that on Prop now, you don't actively intervene and use your military power. You cannot expand your influence. But sure, then they tell you they take the trade off as being seen as weak, right? Then there's no point for them to tell us that they want the US to be better, to have better political posturing in the first place. How you bet? And they want to talk about how they want to better the US citizens' welfare, right? When you literally do not have funding coming in now, we don't see how even when they take this trade-off, it helps their case. Thirdly, creation of a power vacuum. Daphne and Edmund already explained this to you. Okay, but then so right, you have to realize that now US is willing to do anything to better its image for the world. Now you have to realize that when Opp tells you they want to care for the welfare of the people, you then have to realize that what status quo looks like. When US lets its people die because of how inaccessible healthcare is in the States, we tell you the US does not care about their people in the first place because the actor is US now. We don't have to care about things like this. Now moving on to proposition, right? Okay, on the other side, it's very simple. They talk about how war is war and war is bad. But then later on, they tell you that counterfactual is literally intervention. It does not stand. But even so, they tell you that in war, soldiers are not seen as humans and soldiers are seen as disposable. And now the US does not want this to happen. They don't want their people to die, right? But we tell you this is false on several points. Firstly, Prop does not know what the motion is supposed to be. Prop needs to understand that this is an actor motion. The actor is the US. We tell you the country does not care about its people. It wants growth. It wants power and does not want China to outpower it. And these are the things that you cannot achieve from Prop. Even if Opp tells you that, even if Prop tells you that this isn't likely, because the US isn't likely to want to let their people die because the people are the biggest assets of the country. We tell you it doesn't matter in the first place because of how strong the US is, but even so, it does not immediately affect the country. So this point false. Secondly, on political posturing. Firstly, how it makes the conflict worse, right? They tell you on several points. Firstly, they want to protect allies. If US wants to protect their allies so much, let's look at it from an example, right? When US does not intervene, China is likely to step in. Now allies are on your side, wouldn't want to be allies with you anymore because now you're outpowered and now they shift their attention to China. Secondly, people dying. It stands on the same point that US does not care. This is not the grounds we need to debate on in today's debate. Insofar as US remains as the actor of this debate. Thirdly, on economy, right? Okay, they talk about how people develop an anti-US sentiment worldwide, right? They tell you they don't want this to happen and how people don't want to trade with you anymore, right? On 2 points. Firstly, it is intervention to begin with. Secondly, even you want to assume that it is as bad as what is happening, then they give us literally no structural analysis. It's false. And secondly, how even if it is true, it is far worse on the other side. On 3 main points. It is not true on the grounds that when people see US as a superpower, people want to side with it because no country is stronger than it. They have no choice. Secondly, they want to come up here and assume this, right? But fine, now we can also assume that the situation is far worse on the other side because now people have the idea that, hey, the US is strong enough to interview, but they don't want to. So now they won't want to side with the US. I don't have time for my third point, but let's end this here. Insofar as they don't focus on the problem with their soft case and their irrelevant counterfactual, instead focus on putting words into people's mouth and name dropping people in the debate, they lose this debate from the very first speaker. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that speech. Now to finally end the opposition's case, Opp reply. Here.
All right. Can you hear me?
Yep, you're clear.
All right. I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The main problem with for Prop's case is that they never wanted to engage with the elephant in the room. It's Chinese intervention. We are going to tell you 3 things about Chinese intervention. First, when Prop repeatedly refuses to take POIs, when they're saying questionable claims and one-liner assertions about China, they're trying to dodge the inevitable question of what will happen when US's military power decreases and international influence is reduced to nothing. B, when Prop says that China won't care about intervening in the rest of the world, this is untrue and this is merely an assertion, right? In history, no, China has backed Vietnam communists during the Vietnam War, which US was the main opposing force to, and which US gained the upper hand by being able to claim that they had taken part in actively combating a communist regime. They ignore DPM, who tells you
Okay, so we talk about
I'm sorry.
Ralph is
Hi,
unmuted.
government. You're muted right now. Please mute yourself. You may go back to. You could at least have like a bit more seconds. You may go back. Thank you so much.
All right, sure. I'll start in the China thing. All right. Saying China won't care about intervening in the rest of the world is totally untrue and it's just an assertion. China literally backed the Vietnam communists during the Vietnam War, right? Which US was the main opposing force to, and which US would claim the moral high ground by saying that they were opposing an oppressive communist regime. The Prop literally ignores DLO, who tells you basic facts about the threat of invasion of Taiwan in status quo, and also China's constant intrusion into the sea territory and their illegitimate claims over the islands in the South China Sea, which belongs to other Asian nations. C, the US military strength then is posited by Opp to act as the check and balance that keeps China in place. A, nobody is going to use nuclear retaliation, of course, so that's out of the picture because mutually assured destruction is a thing. B, when US has a presence internationally, 2 things that Opp told you. 1, it is easier for US to condemn China, right, and cause China to lose international support and trade partners because China is demonized when everyone perceives US as A, very powerful and are afraid of offending them, and B, benevolent because they've participated in many different conflicts and are seen as peacekeepers in the world as with what LO and DLO has been telling you all the time. B, right, it's easier for US to instantly react to Chinese military action and to defend their allies like Taiwan in the unlikely case in which China decides to stage a direct attack on Taiwan. Right, D, the biggest problem then is that when we tell you all these harms coming out from the lack of US military presence, Prop never engage on the comparative where other superpowers are inherently expansionist and want to expand their influence, just like Russia and China, as with what Russia is currently doing in the world right now. And they never defended how US is able to protect against themselves and their allies against these superpowers from their weaker soft power and their weaker military power perspective. Second thing then on economy. A, Prop told you that they can somehow use 800 billion to create internal investments that will create return for the country and improve the economic state of the country. 800 billion, as DPM has pointed out to you, is merely a drop in the bucket of the spending power of the US, as is evident from their GDP and their fiscal policy, right? I don't see why, when the US has a GDP of 20 trillion, 800 billion is somehow able to revitalize the failing industries of the US and is able to hire a lot more workers to outcompete China, the world's biggest manufacturing giant, with billions of workers that are willing to work for far less than US's minimum wage. B, Prop then says that they are somehow able to win the trade war with China, and somehow with only 800 billion, Opp is completely fine with conceding that we are not going to win this trade war, or we might not be able to win the trade war on both sides, but at least Opp still has more leverage. Opp's US still has more leverage compared to China because they have a stronger military power. Crucially then, US under prop loses support of developing countries that are eager to side with the stronger superpower, to want to get a foothold or want to secure a position of safety, right? These countries then provide valuable natural resources and workforce and are willing to trade with the US at comparatively cheaper prices because they want to be its allies. Now that US does not have this military power that can act as their safety net, they are going to turn to China, who is the second largest military power in the world after all, and is also the biggest economic power directly after the US. No matter how morally incompetent or how morally abhorrent our case sounds, simply because the world that exists on prop is worse for the actor that is US, and it's likely going to be worse when you have actors like China who actively seek to do morally abhorrent things. We think we win.
All right. Thank you so much for that speech. To finally end the debate, Gov reply here.
Firstly, apologies. Sorry. I didn't know how it unmuted. I'm really, really sorry.
Don't worry.
Okay. All right. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, understand that insofar as opposition lives in a vacuum where the US has infinite funds, infinite power, and can take over the world to literally hold all nations accountable to their interests, it's a point in which their case is aspirational at best and ludicrous at worst. So to start off with a clarification, they give this funny response that 800 billion is actually not a lot of money, and therefore you cannot invest it into the US economy and claim all the benefits that you want to claim. We tell you that firstly, this is thrice the amount of whatever China is spending on their military. And we tell you secondly, that if $800 billion is not a lot, then your military operations are far more likely to fail. If you want military intervention on your side to be good, or even useful, if you want the US to be able to take over the Middle East, as quoted in the first speaker, you need to admit that this amount of money is a lot of money. This is a non-issue. We don't think that this is good or important, right? Then we move on to Second Opp. Second Opp thinks that they are pulling a silver bullet when they are in fact shooting themselves in the foot, right? Insofar as they bring up initiatives made by China like Belt and Road. On the point of international prowess of the US and how China is a scary competition, opposition tells you that, oh no, China does BRI and trade war. The best thing for the US to do in retaliation to this is then to fight in the Middle East. No, intuitively, is to improve your economy such that you can actually engage on the same grounds that China is fighting you with, right? The US literally cannot do military intervention in Ethiopia where the BRI is running its course because there is no military conflict to intervene in, right? So even if you want to say that the US wants to do military stuff, they cannot stop expansion of BRI. The intuitive solution is then to make your own sort of retaliation in terms of economic policies to make the US stronger and to combat this BRI thing, right? Secondly, opposition tells you that, oh no, China will crush Taiwan, which is sad. China is already pushing military into Taiwan, which opposition admits is happening. And the US is doing absolutely nothing about it in the status quo, which is actually military interventionism, right? Because the US is scared of China pulling out of US economies and hurting consumers. I think in the point in which we conclusively win this debate is a point in which opposition says, oh, we are not sure if the US will always win, but it's okay because they try. Third Opp by Vertebim says that it doesn't matter if they lose, it's enough that you try. We tell you that this is not a grade school class where a kid draws a painting that looks bad and the teacher says, oh, it's okay, A for effort. This is a matter of literal war, right? An entire national economy is at stake. Oh, okay, let's take Opp's claim and say that as long as the US tries, people will think they're strong. Oh, handing over Afghanistan to the Taliban is very strong. Even if people think the US is strong, insofar as the US loses and wastes a shit ton of money on all their military intervention, It's a point in which people are going to recognize that the US is on an economic downturn and literally cannot compete with the strongest economic power in the status quo, which is China, which opposition so badly fears, right? I think at the point in which the US treats lives as expendable and okay to sacrifice, to not even secure a win, but to try and potentially fail, is when we win this debate, right? On to the last point about welfare and why it matters. The US is a democracy and they are meant to fulfill the will of the majority. It is within the interest of the majority to have better welfare and education, not to have another war to like be involved in where they send American soldiers and American sons into these battlefields, right? Can we improve welfare? Insofar as opposition says that the military on their side will be so strong and it is why the US can win all their wars, yes, $800 billion is enough to divert into welfare policies that can actually make tangible change, right? And yes, even if there is a dominant narrative of private welfare, like private healthcare being better, the fact that there's a shift towards welfare policies like Obamacare shows that the public has a greater want for such welfare policies, and we also have the political will for it to happen. And hence, for all those reasons, I've never once been prouder to propose. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much for the debate. Debaters in the virtually across the house, regardless of the results, all of you did amazing. So you may clap yourself on the back. You may go back to the main room. The results will be announced there. So please let the judges and I have time to deliberate for the results. Thank you so much for the debate.
Thank you.
Thank
By the
you.
way, we're so sorry for unmuting, and Daphne, your profile picture is really cute.